I'm very happy to be here, and I want to talk a bit about how people experience and respond to being victims of discrimination. We live in a world in which people's race or ethnicity affects the kinds of outcomes that we receive. It's also the case that the kinds of outcomes we receive depends upon our gender, whether or not we are gay or straight. Various kinds of physical mobility issues, whether we have a physical disability, whether we're particularly short stature, what weight category we belong to. All of these influence the outcomes that we receive. Likewise, our age matters to the outcomes that we receive. So while we may be against, theoretically, discrimination, it is an outcome or a form of social experience that many people experience. It's a kind of stressor in life. And despite our principled objections to the discrimination that people experience, many of us might believe that people are a little bit overly ready to claim discrimination as a cause of their negative outcomes. That in effect, we believe widely that people who are victims of discrimination are just playing the victim card, that they are attempting to avoid responsibility for their negative outcomes and instead are avoiding responsibility. Why is it that this is unlikely to be the case? First of all, we know that there are social costs. Whenever a member of a disadvantaged group claims to be experiencing discrimination, advantaged group members often attempt to explain that away as due to anything except discrimination. So it's not just that advantaged group members dislike to hear claims of discrimination. It's also the case that disadvantaged group members are well aware of the credibility problem that they have. And so our own research has revealed that disadvantaged group members fear when one of their own claims to be a victim of discrimination, they fear that they will be made to look badly, that they will be made to look like whiners and complainers. So they too often negatively evaluate members of their own group who report discrimination. So the point here is that nobody, advantaged or disadvantaged, is very happy hearing about discrimination claims. So we have lots of reasons here to believe that there are social costs. But what I want to emphasize today are the psychological costs of experiencing and complaining about discrimination. What are the consequences, the psychological consequences of perceiving yourself as a victim of discrimination? Well, first of all, experiencing discrimination is a form of exclusion. It's saying you are not allowed, you are not permitted. Secondly, experiencing discrimination is a kind of devaluation in the broader society, that you aren't respected and valued. Both of those are conditions of poor psychological well-being. We know that for people to thrive, they need to feel included and valued and respected. In addition, we would expect that perceived discrimination will have negative consequences for psychological well-being precisely because it undermines any sense of control. It communicates that you are powerless to control and obtain positive outcomes, desired outcomes, that they aren't under your control. So for those reasons, we would certainly expect that perceived discrimination, and the more you perceive it as pervasive, the more harm it will do to psychological well-being. To address these claims, what we did was a giant meta-analysis. That is, where we quantitatively assess the huge literature that has addressed this question over the years. It involves more than 144,000 people of many different groups, disadvantaged and advantaged groups. And overall, what we find is that there is a negative effect of perceived discrimination on all sorts of measures of psychological well-being. Everything from measures of depression to measures of life satisfaction and self-esteem, feelings of control, and so on. And the next question is, though, for whom is perceived discrimination particularly harmful? Does it matter? Does it differ for different kinds of groups? Well, the first question is whether or not it matters for members of historically disadvantaged groups. What you see here is that the effect of perceived discrimination in disadvantaged groups on well-being is reliably more negative, that is worse, than it is for advantaged groups. But we might want to look at look at what kinds of disadvantaged groups have been studied. What you can see is that there are many faces of discrimination. You can experience discrimination based upon your gender, race, sexuality, and so forth. What you see here is that the effects of perceived discrimination are weakest for discrimination based on sexism and racism. Those are groups that have had civil rights movements and attempted to create a collective identity and struggled against discrimination. Whereas for the other groups that are, the relationship is significantly stronger and more negative. Particularly the most negative is for those with a physical disability. Now, most of the studies in the literature that have looked at these different faces of discrimination have especially examined the effects for racism or different forms of ethnic groups. So we wanted to look at what are the consequences for different ethnic groups. So just looking at those studies, first of all, the one thing we find, and the only time in which perceived discrimination is unrelated to psychological well-being, is for white participants. This is a group for whom discrimination is not very pervasive. However, for all the other ethnic groups, we see that the more you perceive pervasive discrimination, the worse psychological well-being is. It's particularly and significantly worse for groups that have not had any kind of successful collective movements to bring about change, that is, for Arab Muslims, Asians, and other immigrant groups. So, you've been turned down, you didn't get that job, you didn't get that promotion, you've been refused being able to participate in desirable activities because you have a physical disability, you've been denied an apartment in a desirable neighborhood, and so forth. These are all objective experiences of discrimination that people may have. But what we want to understand, and what researchers in the work I've showed you so far have looked at, is people's perceived discrimination. So our perceptions and the objective events that we experience may not be the same thing. So just to take a silly example, when I was a little girl growing up in St. John, New Brunswick, it was the time of the big American space program, and we all watched on television as Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and I was so thrilled. I remember telling my dad at dinner that I want to be an astronaut when I grow up. And he told me, girls can't be astronauts. But you could be, if you want to fly, you could be an airline stewardess. Now I thought, okay, that sounds good. You know, flying to the moon, flying to Saskatoon, no big difference. It's okay. I can do that. The point here is, I had objectively been told about things that I would be excluded from by my gender, but I didn't perceive it as discrimination. I thought airline stewardess was a pretty good idea. Okay, so what we want to understand is, what's the distinction between objectively experiencing encounters of discrimination and people's subjective interpretation of their experience? So for that, we need experiments. We need experiments in which we deliver to people the identical objective event, and then we want to know what's the consequences of perceiving it as discrimination or as perceiving it as due to something else. So there are there's fewer experiments, but there's still a substantial number of them in the literature that have done exactly that. They come in two different varieties. One variety of experiments are of the sort that the experimenter always delivers to people a very negative outcome and then induces some people to believe it's due to their group membership. So for example, I don't get some nice outcome, I'm given negative feedback, and I'm induced to believe it's because they're prejudiced against women, or I still don't get that negative outcome and so on, or I'm induced to believe I didn't get that negative outcome because I don't have the ability and skills. So I didn't get that positive outcome. Okay, what you see here, and this is a very good test of this self-protection idea, what you see in all of these experiments is we see no significant difference in concluding that my outcome is due to discrimination or my outcome is due to I didn't deserve that good outcome. So there's no this is very good evidence that there's no self-protection to be had in claiming discrimination. There's a next set of, both of them are pretty unpleasant conclusions to arrive at. The next set of experiments are very different. They too deliver a negative outcome to people, but they vary something more broadly. We're told in one case that discrimination against women, for example, is pervasive, it's everywhere, or we learn that discrimination against women is a pretty rare thing. It doesn't really happen very much anymore. It's isolated. So here, what we see is truly negative causal effects of perceiving yourself as a victim of discrimination that's pervasive across contexts. So if you believe these outcomes reflect broader devaluation of your group, the same outcome, when it's interpreted as due to discrimination, produces negative harm to psychological well-being. Okay, well, how then, if people experience discrimination and continue to experience it, how do we successfully cope with it? We know that there's a negative consequences for well-being of perceiving pervasive discrimination, but we also know from a whole host of studies that have looked at different disadvantaged groups, that to the extent that they form a positive minority identity, this helps to alleviate those negative consequences of perceiving discrimination. So what can organizations do to help people who encounter discrimination pervasively across contexts, if we know that minority identity is so important? One organization that we've worked with, I'll just take an example, is Little People of America. This is a group of people who have a genetic disorder that produces very short stature, and there are people who experience very severe discrimination in the marketplace and in public spaces and so forth. What we've found is that this organization is able to help people, partly because people with many forms of members of disadvantaged groups are geographically dispersed and are unable to see that there are others who share their condition and that it's it's okay to be disabled as long as one can take pride in that identity. So Little People of America have been very successful in helping their members to improve their psychological well-being by encouraging a positive, disabled and proud minority identity. So I just want to leave you with and return to the point I started with, in a sense, the myth that many of us may hold that perceiving discrimination is an easy thing to do. It's an easy way out. It's a way of explaining and avoiding responsibility for our poor outcomes. That we saw here no evidence that supports this at all, that in fact claiming discrimination is a very difficult thing to do. There are social and psychological costs associated with doing so. And to the extent that we can honestly and help minority group members who are experiencing discrimination to take pride in their identity, we will go a long way to celebrating diversity among us. Thank you.